We're going to begin today with Chapter 2, Newton's Laws of Motion. We're going to break up Chapter 2 into 2 class days. So this will be labeled as Chapter 2A. So some things that we'll cover in Chapter 2, who was Isaac Newton? We'll watch a video with information about him later this week. Aristotle and his ideas on motion, then Galileo's concept of inertia, which kind of threw out Aristotle's idea. We'll talk about mass and how it's related to inertia and the concept of net force. Then later on we'll get to the equilibrium rule, support force, dynamic equilibrium, the force of friction, speed and velocity, and acceleration. There might be a lot of words that sound a little intimidating here, especially if you aren't super up-to-date on your physics terminology, but don't worry. I'm teaching this all with the expectation that none of you know what any of this stuff is, and we're just going to give you kind of the introduction to it. So don't be too concerned. If you follow along and pay attention, I think you'll all be just fine. So Aristotle, he was one of the great philosophers. He lived 2,500 years ago or so. He classified motion into two main types. He said there was natural motion and there was what he called violent motion. Natural motion was motion that's simply straight up or straight down, as in you pick up a ball off the ground and you drop it. Straight up, straight down, natural motion. Violent motion is imposed motion resulting from an external push or pull. So think of violent motion as hitting a ball with a baseball bat, or pushing a cart along a street or something like that. There's direct motion from one object pushing or pulling on the other thing. So violent as in force, a push or a pull is being applied, not violent as in, like PG-13 movies or something like that. So along came Galileo in the early 1500s. This was, almost 2,000 years after Aristotle. Aristotle's ideas, which had been based on his thinking, not so much his actual experimentation, had been kind of accepted as truth for almost 2,000 years. Galileo didn't think that Aristotle's beliefs really held much weight, though. So Galileo said, in the absence of a force, remember a force is just a push or a pull, objects once set in motion tend to continue moving indefinitely, forever. So the idea with this picture is if this ball starts rolling down the slope, without anything to stop it, it should just keep going forever. If there's no friction, no, running into things on the floor, nothing blowing on it, so on, Galileo said this ball should just keep on moving forever. Galileo carried this even a little bit further with the legend of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. The Leaning Tower of Pisa, if you don't know what it is, you can Google a real picture of it, but it's a bell tower in Pisa, Italy, that was built on some kind of unstable ground, and the tower leans, and it's leaned this way for hundreds of years. So anyway, Galileo wanted to prove Aristotle wrong in some other ways, and he climbed to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he had a small object and a big object, like a big rock and a pebble. And he showed that Aristotle's understanding of motion was incorrect. He dropped the two balls at the very same moment, and they fell to the ground at the same time. This showed to the world that, first of all, Aristotle should have done some actual experiments and not just relied on his brain, but also that a heavy object and a small object fall at exactly the same rate when air resistance is negligible. This may not seem like too big of a deal. You might be thinking, okay, who cares? But we'll get into it later on why that actually does matter. And continuing on, Another discovery: in the absence of friction, no force is necessary to keep a horizontally moving object in motion. In other words, this cannon shot out a cannonball. If it weren't for air resistance and gravity pulling the ball down to the earth, the ball should keep moving forever. This is also an important concept. This is what keeps satellites orbiting the earth. This is what keeps Earth orbiting the sun. This concept is, without this in our world, we would not exist. So he devised some more experiments. He had some inclined planes, which an inclined plane is just a slope down or a slope up. So he found that balls rolling down inclined planes and then up others tend to roll back to their original heights. On this top one, if the ball on the left rolls down, it should roll up the hill, and then it'll eventually come to a stop, and then it'll roll back the other direction to where it started. On the middle one, the slopes aren't the same. On the top one, the slopes are the same, but on the middle one, the right-hand slope is shallower. So the ball doesn't roll the same distance covered on that left slope. It rolls back up the second slope until it reaches the same height. That green dashed line across the top is the important part. So Galileo was able to do these experiments, and he understood what happened. So he wondered, well, what happens with this bottom one? We have an inclined plane, but then it's just flat, clear across the way. Judging by the logic of the top one and then the middle one, this ball should keep rolling until it eventually comes to a slope where it can roll up to its original starting height. So there's the question: where is the final position if there's no more slope? His conclusion was this: the tendency of a moving body to keep moving is natural. Every material object resists change in its state of motion. This property of things to resist change is called inertia. And we're going to learn more about inertia in a little bit. Inertia essentially says if something's moving, it wants to keep moving. If something's at rest, it wants to keep at rest. Think about a car that's moving. If the car is moving fast, you have to step on those brakes even harder to make it change its speed. If you're pushing say your car has stalled and it won't start, getting your car to start moving when you're pushing it is a lot more difficult because it's at rest. It wants to keep at rest than once it's already rolling. Once it's already rolling, it wants to keep rolling, and it just takes a little more push to keep it going that way. That is inertia. Then came Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is one of the most famous scientists of all time, and rightly so. He is one of the most well-known and respected scientists of all time. He was born on Christmas Day in 1642, just a few months after the death of Galileo. Now, Isaac Newton was born in England. Galileo was Italian. He was born into a wealthy home, but after his father died, when Isaac was just 4 years old, his mother remarried and left Isaac behind to live with a relative for much of his childhood. Isaac Newton shared that the relationship that he had with his mother and stepfather was not healthy, and they had a pretty dysfunctional home. And he lived into his teen years with an uncle who lived nearby. Isaac Newton was painfully introverted and shy. He was suspicious of others, which probably came from his mother's abandonment when he was a child. He experienced other betrayals from family. He experienced betrayal from his research colleagues who stole his research and plagiarized it, or accused Isaac of stealing theirs. So Isaac Newton was a bit of an outcast in his social world. He had a hard time making friends, and he had a hard time trusting people. He was taken out of school during his teens to work on their family farm, and so he struggled with many subjects. His family deemed him not smart enough to continue investing in his education. A generous uncle later on saw his potential and helped him to pursue an education, though, and got him into a university where he was able to study things that really interested him. As the story goes, he discovered gravity when an apple fell on his head as he was sitting under a tree on their farm. This apple tree that is part of this legend is actually still alive and still growing there. You can go to England and see it. Despite his initial fear of math, Newton invented calculus, and he invented this new math to explain the mathematics of the natural world, particularly of movement, because algebra just really couldn't do it. So even though Isaac had been somewhat trained to be afraid of math because his educational background wasn't that strong, he actually found a deep love for it. So here are some pictures. On the left is the house where Isaac grew up. Like we said, his family was fairly wealthy, but still, after his father's death and some other things in life, Isaac ended up having to work instead of go to school. In front of it, there's this kind of gnarly looking tree, and that is the legendary apple tree that Isaac was sitting under when the apple fell on his head. To the right is Isaac Newton's tomb at Westminster Abbey in London, just across from the Houses of Parliament. Westminster Abbey is the place where the kings and queens of England are buried. So Isaac went from being a kid on a farm who had to work rather than go to school, and whose parents really didn't seem to want to invest much in him, to being somebody who was respected enough by the world and the English people that he was buried in an ornate tomb in the same area where the greatest kings and queens of English history were buried. So his story is really quite an interesting one, and we'll talk more about it in the coming days.